like to introduce our second keynote speaker, is Dr. Eric Verspoor, who's head of group leader of fish genetics at Fisheries Research Services. Eric, I see from your biography that fish conservation and fisheries management issues related to interest-specific biodiversity, population structuring, but in particular also conserving genetic diversity in captive populations.
Yes.
Good answer.
We do a little bit of everything. Well, I'm not sure you guys should even be listening to my talk after we did the last two talks, because I think Andy just about covered everything as regards trout. But I'm going to speak about not Salmon trout, but Salmon salmon. And Atlantic salmon really are just a specialized sea trout that kind of has lost its ability to be a resident fish, or has it? But so I'm going to confine my talk really to Atlantic salmon, but the lessons really from Atlantic salmon are very similar, and the principles that need to be applied to trout management and Atlantic salmon are generally very similar. But the science that's been done is different in some respects, and it reinforces the general message to look at the two species and make the comparison. And I'll also mention some of the work that Andy has done with his colleagues, because Andy isn't just a trout biologist, he's a salmon biologist, and his group has done some of the seminal work on Atlantic salmon that's highly relevant to salmon management as well. So, recorded already. Where's the document? Oh, it's on there. Right. So I wanted to start talking about what is genetics, but I'm going to be very brief about that. But I got a couple of points there I'd like to make in relation to that, which will just help emphasize what the previous speakers had said, and also to again make the point that all salmon are not the same, just like all trout are not the same. Though Andy had made the statement that Atlantic salmon are less variable among populations than are trout. However, as you can see, that just makes trout incredibly extreme. I'd like to talk about genetics and populations, and again that concept that we really have to focus on populations and not on this argument about what is a species, or is it trout versus salmon, or is it Sonocan trout versus Gillaroo trout. They are different populations. Each population requires individual management, really, or population-sensitive management. I'd then like to get on to the issue of local adaptation, which Andy raised, discuss the implications a bit of population mixing, and then go on to the issues associated with stocking. Now, Andy did mention at the beginning of his talk the issue about the precautionary approach, and also he mentioned you can look at genetic variation. You've lost 25%, but you've got 75% there. Well, I'm going to kind of do a little bit the reverse, and I'm going to say, yes, we can look at thousands of genes, but how much do we really know about the genome and the genetics of Atlantic salmon? And it's, again, the argument is why we need to be incredibly careful about what we do. So, genetics concerns heritable differences in individual characteristics and how these are transmitted from parents to offspring. It's a bit touchy. Okay, genetics in trout, salmon is no different from genetics in people. We vary in eye color, we vary in hair color, and we face characteristics, those types of things. It's the same in dogs, it's the same in cattle, it's the same in chickens, it's the same in any animal you look at. Fish are no different. Yet, historically, people seem to think fish are different, but they're not. And again, here, just another example. We're talking about trout and salmon, but these are guppies. You may not be able to see here, but these are fish from different populations of guppies in one small area in the Caribbean. And the coloration patterns of the fish in each of the populations, again, just like trout, is very different, and these are heritable, and this is the norm in the natural world. Right. In Atlantic salmon, particularly, there is this perception that Atlantic salmon everywhere are the same. North American Atlantic salmon here, the river, Miramichi River in Canada, they don't look too much different from Atlantic salmon in the River Dee in Scotland. So a salmon's a salmon, isn't it? Unlike Andy, who showed you all sorts of pictures of trout that look different, so all salmon must be the same. We should manage them differently. So, all salmon are not the same, or are they? Touchy. Better get a bit closer, I guess. That's the thing. Well, here's one heritable difference in Atlantic salmon that most people tend to forget. A female Atlantic salmon and male Atlantic salmon. The sex determination in Atlantic salmon is exactly the same in principle as it is in human beings. This is an XX type chromosome system, this is an XY chromosome system. So that's a genetic difference there from the start. And it's terribly important in management. You wouldn't want to try and cross two male salmon. Here's another example. That's an early maturing male par. That's a 4C winter Atlantic salmon mature male. Again, as Andy mentioned, this is a genotype environment interaction that determines the age of maturation. There's a threshold characteristic associated with this as well. Here we have a situation, this is a gene bank in Norway where they're banking salmon in response to the Gyrodactylus situation. These are all brothers and sisters. They're all raised in a single tank, spawned on the same day. Look at that. You get that little fella there, and you get that big fella there. And those are brothers and sisters. So not only do we have variation among populations, we have variation within populations, we have variation within families. These have been treated exactly the same way. Why do you get one small individual and one big individual? There has to be something in the genes there as well as the environment with it and interactions going on. Here, if you look more closely at a lot of fish, I don't know how often you look really closely at fish, but again, in salmon you've got differences in spotting patterns. If you look at this region here, you can see that the spotting patterns are different. Well, to some degree that's heritable. You look at different salmon populations, you'll find those spotting patterns are quite different. Look even more closely, and you look at things like the bone structure around the eye, you can see individual variation. Well, we haven't even started to look at these characteristics and are they important. We do know that some morphological characteristics are actually of adaptive significance and help salmon to survive and reproduce. So here's something. Are Atlantic salmon just specialized sea trout and they only go to sea? Well, you basically have the two life history patterns here. This is of an anadromous population where you have the spawning, etc., par, smolts going to sea, coming back as mature adults, and this is the resident type. And this is what you tend to see in trout, but you also see it in Atlantic salmon. Here's a situation in Newfoundland, in Little Gull Lake on the Gander River system. Some of you may have heard of it. This is a resident Atlantic salmon. It's probably spawned about 3 or 4 times. It behaves just like a brown trout. This is an anadromous salmon smolt. If you cast into that lake, on one cast you could get this fish, and the other cast you could get that fish.